In addition to endpoints and bindings, you can configure what's known as behaviors in your services. A behavior allows you to add features to a client or a service, and these features are independent of the contract. Examples of when you would want to apply behaviors include enhancing security, endpoint metadata, and for customization of the service. You can apply behaviors to a service contract, the endpoint, or an operation. There are different ways to apply behaviors, which include attributes, API, and config file. I'll show you how to configure a behavior now. Here we have a web service already set up, and I'm going to show you how to configure behaviors for it. But before I show you how to configure a new behavior, I'll show you what Visual Studio creates when you create a new web service project. Under the System.Service Model section here, you have a Behaviors section. And within Behaviors, you have a Service Behaviors. And in particular, we have the Service Metadata section right here. This allows a client to get metadata over HTTP GET and HTTPS GET. The second behavior allows you to include exception details in a fault message. Whenever an exception is raised inside of a .NET web service, it goes to the client as what's called a fault. Because web services are inherently cross-platform, you don't want these platform-specific details flowing to the client. However, for debugging purposes, it might be convenient to change that false to true and then return it back to false when you go to production. So that's just a couple of the behaviors that are already in the config file. Let me show you how to add a new one. To do this, I'm going to do it a little bit differently this time. I'm not going to change the config file directly. I'm going to use a tool that Visual Studio gives you. By right-clicking the config file and selecting Edit WCF Configuration. In this tool, you can see up here there's the service, and then if you open it up, you can see existing endpoints and so on. I want to create a behavior, and then I'll add it to a new endpoint. Behaviors are in the advanced branch right here. Endpoint behaviors, new endpoint behavior configuration, and this I'll give it a new name right here. I'll call it Web HTTP Behavior. And then I'll add a behavior. This is a system pre-configured list of behaviors. I'm going to select the web HTTP behavior, and what that does is let ASP.NET AJAX applications communicate with this service. So that's a behavior that's been configured. Now I'm going to go here and I'm going to add an endpoint to enable that ASP.NET AJAX functionality. New service endpoint. I'll give it a name, Web HTTP Endpoint. And then I'll give it a relative address. And then on the binding, I'll give the binding that works with this ASP.NET AJAX, which is the Web HTTP binding. And then I'll provide a behavior configuration, and here's the name of that behavior we configured earlier. And then we have a new binding. So before I close it, I need to save. And then close, and Visual Studio will update the config file. There. Here you can see this new endpoint right there with the relative address, the name of the behavior, binding name, and down here's the behavior we added. It's an endpoint behavior. with its name that corresponds to the name that we gave the endpoint up there. And it has that web HTTP behavior. So there you have it. You can use the configuration tool to add behaviors as well as going into the config file itself.